Oh shucks. I want to share. Okay. There we go. That's not right. Can you see my screen, my slideshow? Okay. Oh, you're not, you don't have permission to record yet? Oh, Govinda Dasi. Oh, of course. Okay. I'm okay, so Govinda Dasi allowed to record. Thank you. Somehow or other, I didn't include that in my notes, and I'm going to add that right now. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first thing I want to do a little catching up from last weekend, and apology. I missed a step in preparing all the going through all the checklist for the the Zoom thing, and I forgot to share my slideshow, and I don't know how to undo that mistake. So I was assuming that everybody was, last week I was assuming that everybody was seeing my slides, and that was not the case. So that was a little embarrassing. I got onto Facebook and went to look at it, and there's my face taking up the whole screen, which is just embarrassing. So that was one thing. And there was something about the Nimbarka Sampradāya that I missed, which is one of the more prominent modern expressions that we see of the Nimbarka Sampradāya. I mentioned that they're quite active in Vrindavan, and they're especially active with the Banki Bihari temple. Banki Bihari is he's probably the Nimbarka Sampradāya's best known contribution to life in Vrindavan nowadays. And he's very popular, and usually it's the wrongs, as far as I remember, who visit Banki Bihari. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned those two things yesterday. So today's presentation in our series on the four Vaiṣṇava Sampradāyas, which I've called a brief introduction to the schools of Bhakti, is the Shiva Sampradāya, or Rudra Sampradāya. Okay, it's not playing. It's supposed to play. That's better. So last week we covered the Kumara Sampradāya. This week the Shiva Sampradāya, which is also known as the Rudra Sampradāya, the Vishnu Swami Sampradāya, And especially in modern times, the Vallabha Sampradāya. And the Vallabha Sampradāya is also known, as we'll see, as the Pushti Marg. And one of the things that we'll discover along the way, anyway, so they're now known mostly as the Pushti Marg, which is, as far as most folks can tell, the pretty much the modern expression of this Sampradāya. We don't see old school Vishnu Swami Sampradāya type folks, Rudra Sampradāya type folks, who follow Vishnu Swami's Sarva Gyabhashya, because, as we'll see, Vallabhacharya himself also wrote a fairly, I guess, what looks to me like it's probably a fairly voluminous commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. And that's called Anubhashya, or Brahma Sutra Anubhashya. And it's in several volumes. I have that on a slide that we'll see in a few minutes. The teachings, the tattva of the Rudra Sampradāya is called Shuddha Dvaitavad, or purified monism. And we'll take a look at that shortly. Okay. So to recap, we have this verse from the Garga, this excerpt from the Garga Samhita that tells us Vamana, Brahma, Anantashesh, and Sanaka Kumar will appear as Brahmanas by the order of Vishnu for the preservation of eternal righteousness in Kali Yuga. Vishnu Swami, Madhvacharya, Ramanuja, and Nimbaditya will appear respectively as a portion of Vamana, Brahma, Anantashesh, and Sanaka Kumar. These four saviors will be the establishers of the four authorized and empowered spiritual channels of disciplic succession in the period calculated from the reign of Vikrama in 54 BC, subsequently through the 432,000 year cycle of the Kali Yuga. These four authorized and empowered spiritual channels of disciplic succession are to be fully accepted by all beings as any word combination of word formulation of sound frequencies invoked or addressed, audible or inaudible, secret or revealed, ancient or contemporary, outside their auspices, will prove to have absolutely no efficacy. So we hear this strong language of the Shastras. And then my reminder that in Bhaktivinoda Thakur's Navadvip Dham Mahatmya, he has Lord Chaitanya telling Nimbarka that he will accept two essential principles from each of the four Sampradāyas. And so from the Vishnu Swami Sampradāya, he says, Vishnu hoiti duisar koribasvikar, tadiya sarvasvabhava raga marga ar. From Vishnu Swami, I will accept the sentiment that Bhagavan Sri Krishna alone is my everything, tvadiya sarvasvabhava, and the path of spontaneous devotion, raga marga. And we'll see later that, we'll see how these are expressed in, especially in Vallabhacharya's teachings, and especially the Raga Marg. The Raga Marg is acknowledged also in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu toward the end of the second chapter of the first division, Eastern division of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, as including, the Raga Marg is it's accepted by Srila Rupa Goswami as including the Pushti mark. So we'll see that when we get there. So I opened the discussion of the Shiva Sampradāya or the Rudra Sampradāya with a quote from the fourth canto, Srila Prabhupada's purport to a verse in the fourth canto of the Bhagavatam. Lord Shiva is known as the greatest devotee of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is known as the best of all types of Vaishnavas, Vaishnavanam Yata Shambhu. This is a verse from the Bhagavatam itself, a line, actually a pada from a verse in the Bhagavatam itself. And Srila Prabhupada continues, consequently, Lord Shiva has a Vaiṣṇava Sampradāya, the disciplic succession known as the Rudra Sampradāya, just as there is a Brahma Sampradāya coming directly from Lord Brahma. The Rudra Sampradāya comes directly from Lord Shiva. He says Lord Shiva is one of the great personalities, 12 great personalities, as stated in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So he's taken this verse from the 6th canto, where these 12 Mahajanas are named. Svayambhu Narada Shambhu Kumara Kapilo Manu Prahlado Janako Bhishmo Balar Vaya Sakayar Vayam. There are 12 great authorities in preaching God consciousness. The name Shambhu means Lord Shiva. So he's pointing out how Shiva is named in this verse as Shambhu. His disciplic succession is also known as the Vaiṣṇava Sampradāya. And the current Vaiṣṇava Sampradāya is also known as the Vallabha Sampradāya. The current Brahma Sampradāya is known as the Madhva Gaudiya Sampradāya. So even though Lord Shiva appeared to preach Mayavad philosophy, at the end of his pastime in the form of Shankaracharya, he preached the Vaiṣṇava philosophy. Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam Mudhamante. He stressed worshiping Lord Krishna or Govinda 3 times in this verse, and especially warned his followers that they could not possibly achieve deliverance or mukti simply by word jugglery and grammatical puzzles. If one is actually serious to attain mukti, he must worship Lord Krishna. That is Sripad Shankaracharya's last instruction. So we see here, the reference here is to Lord Shiva's appearance as Shankara, also another name for Lord Shiva. But Shankaracharya, Lord Shiva is said to have told Parvati that in the Kali Yuga he would appear as a Brahmana, and he would teach from what he called Asat Shastra. So non-eternal Shastra. He would create some non-eternal Shastra, and this is Shankaracharya's Shariraka Bhashya, or his commentary on the Vedanta Sutra, which teaches the Kevaladvaita philosophy that we understand as among the Vaiṣṇava Sampradāyas, the much reviled Mayavadi teachings. And this is where the chorus joins in with hissing and booing. So Shankaracharya, he's set up as a sort of, not exactly a villain, but, kind of an antagonist. And the Vaishnava acharyas, including Vishnu Swami, appeared in different ways refute the Mayavad philosophy of Shankaracharya. So that's a little problematic considering the timeline of
of Vishnu Swami, because he predated the appearance of Lord Buddha, as we'll see. He appeared, Vishnu, this is a kind of a typical representation of Vishnu Swami. There, the the timeline on Vishnu Swami is a little complicated by the fact that in the lineage, there were three acharyas named, who became, two of whom later became named Vishnu Swami. The Adi Vishnu Swami, the original Vishnu Swami, whom we traditionally accept as the foundational acharya of the Rudra Sampradāya, appeared about the 3rd century BCE, shortly after Krishna's appearance. And he appeared in South India. There's not a lot known about him. There's more known by the later acharyas, known as Vishnu Swami. I think one appeared in the 8th century and another in the maybe 14th century of the Common Era. And the Adi Vishnu Swami appeared in the 3rd century before the Common Era. So that would be shortly after the time of Krishna's appearance. So we would have to assume that one of the later Vishnu Swamis is the Vishnu Swami who came up with their reputation of the Shariraka Pasya. The worshipful deity of Vishnu Swami Sampradāya has been Lord Nrsimhadev until more modern times. As I mentioned, we don't see many expressions of this Sampradāya, the ancient form of this Sampradāya, in modern times. Vishnu Swami is also said to have begun the tradition of Tridandi Sannyas, and the 108 sannyas names that we see. These are listed in the Gaudiya Kantahara. These are said to have been attributed to Vishnu Swami. And so these 108 names include the 10 names that were adopted by Shankaracharya as part of his Dashanami tradition. So those are ancient names like Giri, Vana, Ashram, and a few others. So this is tradition, these names and this tradition of Tridandi Sannyas is traced back to Vishnu Swami. I'd like to point out, though, that even in the Srimad Bhagavatam, we see some reference to Tridandi Sannyas in the pastime given in the 11th canto of the Brahmana of Avanti. This Brahmana of Avanti is, as many of us know, was a very, very wealthy Brahmana, but he was also very stingy. It's said in the Bhagavatam that he wouldn't even spend money on his own sense gratification. So because of this characteristic, everybody turned against him and eventually started stealing his wealth until he was left with nothing. And eventually he realized his actual situation as simply a miserable human being, and accepted sannyas, and is described in the Bhagavatam as carrying a triveni, which means three rods or three reeds together. So this Tridandi sannyas tradition is also seen in Srimad Bhagavatam, but as a sort of institution, this is traced to Vishnu Swami. A great commentator on the Bhagavatam, Sridhar Swami, who we often refer to as the ancient Sridhar Swami because we want not to confuse him with our Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Dev Goswami. He was not that ancient. He was maybe 13th or 14th century sannyasi, also said to be a sannyasi in the Rudra Sampradāya. The teaching of Shuddha Dvaita, I kind of boiled it down to its main essential ingredients. So Shuddha Dvaita means pure non-dualism, Shuddha Advaitavad. So what that refers to is an essential identity between the soul and God, between the jiva and the param Brahman. So they're both Brahman, and so they're identical in their essence. However, unlike the Kevala Dvaita teaching, the Shuddha Dvaitavada Vishnu Swami and subsequently Vallabhacharya and his followers recognizes the Supreme Personality of Godhead as the whole and the jiva as a part, an angsha. And he also gives a comparison, as we do, of sparks and the fire. Sparks and fire have the same essential substance, and they have similar characteristics, heat and light. But the sparks come from the fire, and they're anu, they're tiny, whereas the fire is the source, and it's great. The Shuddha Dvaitavad also teaches that everything, including the material creation, is Krishna's Leela. Of course, we see that in the Bhagavatam, that the material creation is the Lord's Srishti Leela, his Leela of creation. So this is also part of his play, and also in agreement with the teachings of the Bhagavatam, that everything is identified in at least one sense with Krishna himself. We learn in the second canto of the Bhagavatam. Sometimes we talk about the Lord Chaitanya, and we'll talk about more about this at our last meeting when we talk about the Madhva Sampradāya, our Sampradāya. We talk about the teaching of Achintya Bheda Bheda as being Lord Chaitanya's teaching. But Lord Chaitanya didn't exactly make it up. I think Jiva Goswami coined the phrase, coined the term, but the teaching is actually not there just in the Bhagavatam, but it's in the Rig Veda, because we see a chapter in the second canto of the Bhagavatam, and that second canto is meant to teach us how everything in this world is identified in a sense with Krishna, because it's one of Krishna's energies. And as we see in the chapter called Purusha Sukta Confirmed, that these energies are non-different from Krishna himself. And so Purusha Sukta is a collection of prayers in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Vedas, as I remember it. And so this Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva is actually the oldest teaching of the Vedas. It's because it's there in the Rig Veda, and it's confirmed in the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, and explained more carefully by Srila Jiva Goswami in his Sandarbhas. So everything is Krishna's. I mean, in a sense, everything is Krishna's Leela. So everything is identified with Krishna. They often also compare it to the gold in the gold mine. The gold mine is the source of the gold, and the gold is the same thing. And I remember once talking with a friend of mine who found herself identifying quite strongly with the Pushti Marg, and I can understand um, any number of reasons why devotees might find that attractive. Um, you know that this one devotee um, shared her opinion with me that Vallabhacharya's teaching was perhaps higher than Lord Chaitanya's, and I said, well, I don't know about that. My understanding of the Shuddha Dvaitavad is that everything is Krishna, but our understanding is that everything is Krishna's. Everything belongs to Krishna. So everything that is Krishna implies that everything should be used in Krishna's service. And the Pushti Marg devotees are quite expert at this. They're very well developed in the arts, in making cultural presentations of Krishna Lila, and their worship of their deity, Srinathji, who we'll meet toward the end, is nothing less than spectacular. Srila Prabhupada says, Vallabhacharya worships Krishna with great pomp. And, but our teaching seems to imply that everything is Krishna's, and therefore it must be used. This is how I was seeing it back then. This was probably about 25 or 30 years ago, that everything is Krishna's, so everything belongs to Krishna, so therefore it must be used in Krishna's service. A kind of a little subtle difference. And that, by minimizing Mahaprabhu and his teachings, that we miss the glory of kirtan, although not entirely, because Vallabhacharya taught that Vishnu Swami and following him, Vallabhacharya, teach that the path of spiritual perfection is bhakti. And he specifically mentions the 9 angas of bhakti. And there's considerable emphasis on self-surrender or atma-nivedana, which we'll see is a common thread running through all 4 of the Sampradāyas. One thing I hope that we all are able to draw from our discussions, as brief as they are, on these 4 Sampradāyas, is the kinship among these 4 schools of bhakti. The differences are certainly there. Some subtle, some more subtle than others, some a little more obvious, as we'll see next week when we look at the Sri Sampradāya, which is not a Ragmarg Sampradāya. It's quite explicitly a Vaidhi Marg Sampradāya. And their goal, even though it's Vaikuntha Prem, they refer to it as moksha. So their actual goal will be something a little different than the Rudra Sampradāya and the Madhva Gaudiya Sampradāya aspire for. But still, we see that self-surrender is a thread that runs through all these schools. And it's one of the things that ties all of them together in that kinship that I mentioned. So in the modern age, the expression that we have of the Vishnu Swami or Rudra Sampradāya is the Sampradāya coming from Vallabhacharya, known as the Pushti Marg. So Vallabhacharya was more or less a contemporary with Lord Chaitanya. He was a little older. Maybe it looks like 6-7 years older than Lord Chaitanya. He is one of the great figures in the kind of bhakti renaissance that took place over 3 or 4 centuries in what we might consider the Middle Ages. He was one of the great figures along with, the names just escaped me. Anyway, along with a number of others, Guru Nanak and others. And he was born in 1479 in Champaran. And we'll see there in some discussion from Srila Prabhupada that there are a couple of different ideas about where he appeared. But traditionally, they accept him as having been born in Champaran, which is now the Rajpur district. His family actually had been living in Varanasi, but they left while Vallabha's mother was pregnant with him because they were expecting an attack by the Mughals, by the Muslims. It didn't happen right then, but still they relocated. In his youth, I think by the age of 11, he had already developed a very strong reputation as a scholar and a debater. His intention was to live a celibate life, but his deity instructed him to marry. So he married and he had 2 sons, Vitalnath and Govinda. Actually, the Pushti Marg devotees accept that his later deity, Srinathji, told him that he himself would appear as Vallabhacharya's son Vitalnath. And so he was he's also known as Gosainji, and he's kind of the main branch, I guess you could say, the main branch of this sub-branch of the Vishnu Swami Sampradāya. He wrote quite prolifically, as you might expect of someone as scholarly as he. And the 3 main written works that I just wanted to mention were his Anubhashya or Brahma Sutra Anubhashya, his 4 books of commentaries on the Vedanta Sutra, his commentary on the Bhagavatam called Subodhini, of which we only have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 10th cantos available. And then 16 short verse type compositions to teach his followers about devotional life called Shodasha Grantha, which means 16 books. So I mentioned that he sort of established a sub-branch of the Sampradāya called the Pushti Marg. And this is the current expression, as far as we know, of the Rudra Sampradāya in the modern age. And he took a little different tack from Vishnu Swami's teachings in a way perhaps somewhat similar to Lord Chaitanya, who we accept as having appeared, although that's a subject of discussion, in the Brahma Sampradāya, and teaches, his teachings are a little different from the Madhva Sampradāya, the original Brahma Sampradāya. Pushti means nourishing, so he calls his path the Pushti Marg. I believe even in Vishnu Swami they called it Pushti Marg. It was the nourishing path. They refer to themselves as the path of grace. So sometimes you hear Westerners thinking Pushti Marg means the path of grace, but actually Pushti means nourishment, just as we see in a Bhagavatam verse that describes how bhakti works. Tushti, Pushti, Kshura, Paya. 3 things happen at once and progressively as we engage in bhakti, just as Tushti, Pushti, and Kshura, Paya happen simultaneously and progressively as we eat a meal. So Tushti means pleasure, Pushti means nourishment, and Kshura, Paya means relief from hunger. So, so this Pushti Marg, and it's quite popular. We see the Pushti Marg especially in Rajasthan and Gujarat and in the Vrindavan area. Their big center of worship is, as we'll see, in Natwar, which is in Rajasthan, which is where their main deity, Sri Nathji, with whom we also have a very strong connection, and with whom we very strongly identify. There's a whole, how might you say it gently, vigorous discussion between Pushti Marg devotees and Gaudiya devotees over this deity, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. At the end of his life, he accepted sannyas on Sri Nathji's instruction. Just as he married on the Lord's instruction, he accepted sannyas on the Lord's instruction. He didn't do this on his own. He went to Benares, lived on the bank of the Ganges, and he disappeared in 1531 at the age of 52 by actually devotees and his family, even though he had accepted sannyas. They all gathered for a last meeting with him. And then he entered the Ganges. And the devotees described that there was a kind of like a flame that arose from the river as Vallabhacharya immersed himself for the last time in the Ganga. We also know that he had considerable contact with Lord Chaitanya and his followers at times. And I want to read a little bit from just one passage in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, because it includes a purport where Srila Prabhupada also gives some information about Vallabhacharya. It'll be in the 19th chapter of the Madhya Lila. But we know that he approached Lord Chaitanya and wanted to share with him his Brahma Sutra Anubhashya. But because Vallabhacharya he often expressed some pride in his accomplishments when he introduced this bhashya, this Vedanta Sutra bhashya that he wanted to share with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He apparently, according to Chaitanya Charitamrita, boasted that it was better even than Sridhar Swami's, which is an interesting claim to have made, because Sridhar Swami was one of his predecessor acharyas, and Lord Chaitanya didn't appreciate that very well, and he rebuked him in rather strong terms, implying that was a little, I think the term that devotees like to use nowadays sometimes is unchaste. He said that it's a chaste wife does not give up her swami, which is also a word for husband. And Vallabhacharya was not very happy about that, but he later approached Gadadhar Pandit and received instruction in worshiping Krishna in Madhurya Rasa, and got a Krishna mantra from him. I'm not sure which mantra. We might guess the Gopal mantra or the Kama Gayatri. But we don't know that for certain. There was something else that came to my mind, and it has just escaped me. As I mentioned also, it was about their worship. Generally, the Pushti Marg, the main mood of the Pushti Marg is the Vatsalya Bhava. Predominantly, the mood is one of guardianship of Krishna, like a parent. So they have a very strong parental mood. And the deity that the Pushti Marg devotees worship in their homes, and the worship in the Pushti Marg is not centered on temples. It's centered on the home, and it's in the homes that the Pushti Marg devotees, engage in their worship of Krishna. And quite often, generally, their deities will be Bal Gopal, or those little baby Krishna deities. There was a period when they became very popular. I think when many of us started having children back in the 70s and maybe early 80s. And a lot of us found ourselves with little Bal Gopal deities on our altars, perhaps with our kids in mind, that here's a deity that they can worship as well. So this is their main thread. And just as the two windows of opportunity that are generally identified with the Gaudiya Sampradāya are Sakyarati and Madhuryarati. So the main window of opportunity that we identify with the Pushti Marg is Vatsalyarati, or parental love for Krishna. However, and perhaps because of the influence of our Gadadhar Pandit, who is among our worshipable deities here in Honolulu, at the temple in Honolulu, installed as the Panchatattva, part of the Panchatattva by Srila Prabhupada back in 1972. Perhaps because of his having gotten initiation into Madhurya Rasa from Gadadhar Pandit, there's also a strain of Madhurya Rati, and they have a little different mood. I think that their mood is perhaps a little more like the right-wing gopis following Chandravali. And their center of worship would be, I think, the bank of the Jamuna, rather than, where the Rasastali, where that we see as sort of the center of our universe. But we also know that there are other more modern intersections between, places where the Pushti Marg and the Gaudiya Sampradāya meet. One is in our Srila Prabhupada. When Srila Prabhupada felt that it was his guru's desire that he go to the West in order to teach Krishna consciousness to the English-speaking people. That was the instruction that he was given at the beginning of his life, with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati at their first meeting, and repeated again as a suggestion at the end of his Guru Maharaj's presence among us. He felt very strongly the need to satisfy this. He took this suggestion on his head as an order, and felt compelled to carry it out by any means. So we know that in the mid-60s, he approached Sumati Morarji, who at that time was the head of a very large steamship line, the Scindia steamship line out of Bombay. And he approached her offices hoping to convince Mrs. Morarji, who was herself a Pushti Marg devotee. Her family had been Pushti Marg devotees for many, many generations. So she was also a devotee of Krishna. So on that common basis, Srila Prabhupada made his appeal to Mrs. Morarji. She didn't think it was a very good idea, considering his age and what they understood of the conditions in the United States at the time. Especially, he was talking about going to New York City. And that is actually a desire that he had following his own spiritual master. Srila Sridhar Maharaj has told us that Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur had on a couple of occasions expressed a desire that if he'd had another 10 years to live, he would like to have spent them in New York City, because he felt this was this had overtaken London, I guess, as the most important city in the world. So Srila Sridhar Maharaj opined on one occasion that that our Srila Prabhupada, Swami Maharaj, had given their Srila Prabhupada, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, those 10 years and a couple more as perhaps as a sort of bonus. So eventually, apparently by doing something like a sit-in strike outside Mrs. Morarji's offices, he eventually got a meeting with her. And she tells us herself, there's a video of her being interviewed about this, and she is quite blunt about her response to Srila Prabhupada's proposal. And so she said that she responded with something like, "What are you, crazy, you old man? Um, it's cold there and there's nothing to eat. You'll just die there. Nobody there has any interest and you'll just die there." But Srila Prabhupada was able to wear her down, and it's very much to her credit and to the credit of the entire Pushti Marg that that she was actually the person who made it possible for Srila Prabhupada to get passage to the West. And of course, we have more recent intersections with the Pushti Marg. Many of the, because their practice includes kirtan, the Navanga Bhakti is their, is their thing. Their practice includes kirtan. And so one of their more prominent devotees in the West, actually a Western devotee who became a sort of teacher in the Pushti Marg, a gentleman named Shamdas, with whom I became friends in the 90s. He engaged in kirtan with Gaudiya Vaishnavas, and they engaged in kirtan with him. So he became very famous as a kirtaniya, probably one of the most famous of the kirtaniyas until his untimely death in, what's that town? Anyway, that town on the coast, that nice little resort town, a few years ago, which came as a shock to so many. I mean, it was a huge shock to so many of us because Shamdas was such a vigorous person and a vigorous proponent of kirtan. And even though their mood may be a little different, you could often hear him chanting in kirtan, sometimes for minutes at a time, Jai Radhe, Jai Radhe. So we have these more recent connections as well, very strong connections with the Pushti Marg. The ancient connection would include their worship. I'm going to skip ahead here. Would be their worship of Sri Nachi. Now, the Pushti Marg's hagiography tells us that Vallabhacharya discovered the deity of Sri Nachi at Govardhan and took him under his care and began to worship him on Govardhan. This is the same deity that we say was discovered by Madhavendra Puri at Govardhan, and that Madhavendra Puri, we see in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhavendra Puri established the worship of his Gopal deity on the Govardhan Hill. And because of the harassment by the Muslims in following years, Sri Nachi or Gopal was moved to Rajasthan. And there are interesting stories, diverging accounts of the worship of this deity, sometimes in combination, for at least for some time, jointly by the Gaudiyas and the Pushti Marg devotees. One thing I heard from Shamdas was that the Pushti Marg devotees objected to the Gaudiyas, because they were Bengalis, I guess, insistence on worshiping Gopal with Shakti, that they had to also, that was part of why the Pushti Marg devotees ended up somehow or other getting control of the service to the deity before he was moved to Rajasthan. The Gaudiyas probably have quite different stories about how all that came to pass. However it came to pass, Srinathji is now worshipped with great, as Srila Prabhupada says, with great pomp at Nathdwar in Rajasthan. And I wanted to go back here to where this other connection that we see with the Pushti Marg and the Gaudiya Sampradāya. And these are two verses in the second chapter of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where Srila Rupa Goswami acknowledges Vallabhacharya as a practitioner of Krishna Bhakti. So in text 269 in that second chapter is the chapter on sadhana bhakti. And it covers both Vaidhi sadhana bhakti and Raganuga sadhana bhakti. And so at the end of the section on Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, he says, Rupa Goswami says, Shastrokthaya prabhalaya tattan Marya dayanvita Vaidhi bhaktirayam kaischan Maryada marga uchyate. Some persons call Vaidhi bhakti the path of rules, Maryada marga, since it is bound by strong limitation of the rules mentioned in the scriptures. So we understand from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that the qualifications for engaging in Vaidhi sadhana bhakti include strong faith in the instructions of the scriptures and the spiritual master. And that the motivation is also that desire to satisfy the instructions of the Guru and the Shastras. And then later in text 309, at the end of the section on Raganuga sadhana bhakti, he says, Krishna tad bhakta karunya matra labhaika hetuka pushti margataya kaischidiyam raganugochate. The mercy of Krishna and his devotees is the only cause of attaining Raganuga bhakti. Some call this type of devotion, Raganuga bhakti, Pushti Marg. So Vallabhacharya felt that the emphasis on following the injunctions of the Shastras could serve as an impediment to, awakening the kind of love for Krishna, the kind of natural love for Krishna that he wanted his followers to have. So I was going to read one of the pastimes where Lord Chaitanya and Vallabhacharya met, but I think because it's already 6:30 here in Hawaii, I can only read the purport of the first verse. So I think I'll go back to Srinathji or our Gopal here as I read this. So this is in the 19th chapter, and this is the Srila Prabhupada's purport to text 61. The verse says, at that time, Sri Vallabhapata was staying at Adailagram, and when he heard that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had arrived, he went to his place to see him. And Srila Prabhupada writes, Vallabhapata was a great learned scholar of Vaishnavism. In the beginning, he was very much devoted to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But since he thought that he could not receive proper respect from him, he later joined the Vishnu Swami sect and became an acharya of that sect. Now, we can note that in those days, there was considerable movement um, by devotees among the different groups of teachers. We know that later, Baladev Vidyabhushana, um, who had been following a different Sampradāya, when he came in contact with the Gaudiyas in Puri, he actually essentially took them as his shiksha gurus. So although he came from a different lineage, we accept him as an acharya in our lineage, even though he might have received his original initiation elsewhere. This Sampradāya has had great influence in Vrindavan near Gokula and in Bombay. So they're particularly influenced, because of that parental mood. Their main temple, Srinathji's temple in Nathdwar, it's actually a Haveli, or it's the kind of palatial household of the descendants of Gosainji or Vitalnath, one of the sons of Vallabhacharya. And it's rather palatial, but it's, they're not so much into temple worship, but they do have this one center, which is a kind of a big place of pilgrimage. But they also are very active because of that. They're also very active in Gokula, especially around Nandagram, I would guess. Vallabhabhata wrote many books, including a commentary on Srimad Bhagavatam called Subodhini Tika, and notes on Vedanta Sutra in the form of an Anubhashya. He also wrote a combination of 16 short works called Shodasha Grantha. The village where he was staying at Ailagram, or Adeligram, was near the confluence of the rivers Ganges and Jamuna on the other side of the Yamuna from Prayag, about a mile from the river. A temple of Lord Vishnu there still belongs to the Vallabha Sampradāya. Vallabhabhata was originally from a place in southern India called Trilanga. And then he goes into apparently drawing from Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati's commentary on the on the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. So he says that his father was Lakshman Bhatt Dikshita, and there are a couple of different opinions about where Vallabha was born. It says, after studying for 11 years at Varanasi, Vallabhacharya returned home. On his return, he heard that his father had departed from the material world. Keeping his brother and mother at home, he went to the banks of the Tungabhadra to a village called Vidyanagara, where he enlightened Krishnadev, the grandson of the King Bukaraja. And then he traveled. He had two sons, Gopinath and Vitalnath, or Vitaleshwara, and accepted sannyas in his old age and passed away in, here it says 1452 Shakabda era, or 1530. I think we have 1531. I probably got that date from Wikipedia or something. And passed away from the material world at Varanasi. So, so we can see that there's actually we can actually identify a number of very strong connections between the Gaudiya Sampradāya, the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, and the Pushti Marg Vaishnavas, and that in many ways they're very similar. And so it's not hard to understand that many of us may be able to enjoy hearing Srimad Bhagavatam together or engaging in Nam Sankirtan together. Shouldn't be a very great surprise, because there really isn't, although sometimes it may feel like it, there really shouldn't be much of a sense of rivalry. Instead, I think a sense of kinship among all the four Sampradāyas is something that we should try to envision. Okay, and it occurs to me that as I want to end here, I want to open things up. I think I forgot to make it impossible for people to mute themselves. But right now I want to make sure, oh dear. I want to make sure that that we have an opportunity for devotees to engage in any discussion, and I'm having a hard time finding my Zoom panel here. So that I can allow people to unmute themselves. I find myself quite lost here for a moment. Oh, that's not what I want. Okay, so no, that's not at all what I want. Well, let's see if it works. Because I didn't. Oh, I see a mute all. Oh, I didn't uncheck allow participants to unmute themselves. So you should be able to unmute yourselves if you have any questions or comments or reflections that you'd like to share with the rest of us before we adjourn. Anyone?
I have one. Maybe if I can ask a question.
Oh dear.
Much.
Okay. Guru Vakya, are you trying to say something? I can't.
If you allow me, it's a question.
I have a wrong setting somewhere. Allow participants to. Okay, well, either I've done something. Oh, here we go. I can see everything again. I don't know how that happened. Didn't. Okay, I guess nothing's happening. Okay, so with a lot of gratitude, I guess this is a good time for us to adjourn. And I'll see you folks back next week, next Tuesday, early morning, my time. And we'll discuss the Sampradāya coming from Lakshmi, the goddess of fortune, known as the Sri Sampradāya or the Ramanuja Sampradāya. Thank you so much. And I apologize for the technical glitch here at the end. I really would love to have heard from any and all of you. Hare Krishna.
Hey, Bob, thank you very much.
Oh, now I hear people.